Another goal that we have as readers is to consider point of view and perspective. And so we want to look to be able to compare and contrast the point of view from which different stories are narrated. Narrator being who's telling the story. And this is going to include being able to recognize the difference between a first-person narration and a third-person narration. So, point of view is how a story is told. Out of my mind focuses on a first-person point of view because we've got pronouns like I or me. I. Look at this example. I wear tiny gold earrings. Sometimes people never even ask my name, like it's not important or something. It is. My name is Melody. Thus, that first person narration or point of view. A third person narration is where a narrator is speaking of characters. Land of Stories is a great example. This excerpt comes from Land of Stories. Connor heard his sister's high-pitched scream before he realized what had happened. A large troll had jumped right in front of them on the bridge. And so these types of pronouns and the characters' names tell us that the person telling the story isn't actually involved in the story. Now there is a second-person narration. It's not something that we tend to see commonly, but I did find an example in this particular book with a You Choose. And in this story, you can see where the person who's writing refers to you as if you're the character in the story. It's a beautiful spring morning in Kentucky. You're in one of the grand flower gardens that fill the yard around a large, beautiful home. And so you can see how it's bringing you then into the story. So that's telling the difference between especially first and third person point of view. Now we also have perspective, and this includes then a person's view of things, and it's influenced by that person's schema or their background and knowledge. To understand an author's perspective, you really have to consider that voice or attitude that they're bringing in. We have to be careful to separate our perspective or point of view. This poem gives us a really great opportunity to do so. It's called Homework by Jane Yolen. And as you read each stanza, you start to get an idea for how Jane Yolen is the writer, because she's referring to herself, me here, how she feels about homework. And so when we analyze this poem, we can get an idea of her attitude or her perspective. And so in your notebook, put the sample of the poem, and then I'd like you to take a look at this. After reading the poem Homework, I can tell that the author's perspective is. Figure out how the author feels about homework. Now, narration and point of view refers to the fictional texts. I want to switch gears and think about what happens when we read nonfiction. And these were some notes that I made as I was examining nonfiction. And I kind of came up with this thought. Nonfiction is a group of texts which includes in which the author makes claims or assertions to readers about the real world, real people, real experiences, ideas, or beliefs. So there's that focus on being real. So when we think about point of view or a perspective, now we're looking at comparing and contrasting what we might call a first-hand or a second-hand account. And it's interesting to look at sometimes the same event or topics so that we can describe the difference in focuses and the information that's provided. So with a primary source, that's when an event is told about at the time the event's happening. And examples often include speeches, photographs, or even letters. Now I found this clip from an article that I read from Muse magazine. And it was about the big green monster coaster, or the King Ka, in Six Flags, New Jersey. And it was the writer's account of riding the coaster. And you can tell because the writer is using first person, here I. And so as the writer is describing this account, I was the only child in the car. I was sitting alone. So he's then describing this event. By contrast, a secondary source will tell about an event, but perhaps after the events occurred. What's different about a secondary source is it's often someone who may not have actually been involved in the experience, but is using the information that they've learned about the event to tell about it. One of the examples that I found of a secondary source was this article in Time for Kids about China destroying illegal ivory. And it writes about, or the author writes about what had been done. The author wasn't actually participating in the destruction, but rather they've learned about it. And so this gives us an example of a secondary source. Examples of secondary sources often include textbooks, magazines, and perhaps reference material that we can find in print or in digital form. Now, what's interesting is I found an article in Faces magazine, and as I was reading it, it's called A Day in Istanbul. And I start reading it, and it's, my name is Melis, and I live in Istanbul. And I thought, oh, this is a first person, or a first-hand account. But then I noticed, look at the writer's name. So is this writer pretending to be Melis, a child, or is perhaps this writer writing Melis's account as told to her? So just something to keep in mind as you're reading texts, to definitely read with a critical eye. But above all, we're going to start learning to examine point of view and perspective in texts.